Hi, welcome everyone. I'm Laura Norman. I'm the media specialist at Vassalboro Community School. I'd like to welcome you to our program tonight, Vassalboro Reads 2021. It's our speaker series. We're so glad you could come. Just a couple of quick housekeeping items before we get started. During the presentation, for the best sound experience, we ask that you keep your volume muted to minimize background noise. Afterward, we'll have time for questions and answers. At that time, it will work best if everyone mutes their volume except for the person speaking. Finally, we want to note that we will be recording this program and posting it publicly online. So without further ado, I'm very excited to introduce my fellow program coordinator, Brian Stanley, Vassalboro Public Library Director, who will introduce today's wonderful speaker. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Laura. I'm Brian Stanley, the director at Vassalboro Public Library. Thanks for joining us for the event today. Our entire community read is made possible by a Libraries Transforming Communities grant through the American Library Association. We're seeking to stimulate discussion and awareness around the Alewives and their history here in Vassalboro and come away as a more informed community. We have some more future online events coming up, so please make sure to check vassalbororeads.me for any updates. I'm very happy to see so far that people are viewing our videos after we publish them. So tonight we're joined by Barbara Brennessel. She will describe the biology, natural history, and ecology of river herring and outline some efforts to restore river herring populations, including dam removal projects, culvert replacement, bycatch reduction. All of these efforts have local importance to us here in Vassalboro. So without further delay, I'll introduce you to Barbara Brennessel, and thank you for joining us, Barbara.
Well, thank you. I want to thank Brian and Melora and other organizers for selecting my book as the community read and for inviting me to share some information about river herring. I am trying to advance and it's not advancing. Here we go. Sorry. I first became interested in river herring when I found out that they spawn near my home in Cape Cod, and I learned that their numbers were decreasing dramatically. So I became a herring count volunteer, which essentially means that I stand by the river and I count the number of fish that are going upstream to spawn. And we're doing this in a lot of runs, coastal runs in New England, so that we can monitor the status of our herring runs. Now, what we're really counting when we count fish going upstream are actually two different species of fish. They're alewives and they're blueback herrings, and they're very difficult to tell apart. They have very similar morphology, so we collectively refer to them as river herring because when they're running upstream, you can't really tell the difference between the two species. But there are some subtle differences in morphology or what they look like. But the best way to tell them apart is actually to crack them open, which we don't usually do when we're watching them going upstream. But if you were to open up these fish, you would see that alewives have a pinkish abdominal lining, whereas blueback herrings have a dark purple or black abdominal lining. They're also, I'll go back, have a little bit of difference in the shape of the fish. The alewives tend to be a little bit fatter, and the blueback herrings have a darker dorsal or upper surface. But once again, when they're running upstream, you really can't tell the difference very easily. So we're collectively lumping these fish into the category of river herring, even though they're two different species. Now, I want to make an important point here, in that these fish are not Atlantic herring. Atlantic herring are a completely different species. They look a little bit like river herring, but Atlantic herring spend their entire life in the open ocean. And as I'll mention later, that's not the case with river herring. Atlantic herring are a completely marine species, and these are the type of fish that are harvested and used for split or smoked herring or kippers. So related fish, but they're not the fish that we're talking about tonight. Now, I often wonder about the name alewife because that is a curious name for a fish. And I did some research into this, and there are some Native American terms for the fish which sound a little bit like that, and some Old French or Old English terms that are pretty similar. But the best explanation that I found is that the name came from possibly portly alewomen or alewives who worked in colonial taverns. And this came about in 1674 when John Josselyn was visiting the colonies from England, and he was writing home to describe some of the things that he was finding in the colonies. And he was describing these fish that they don't have in England. And he said that the alewife is like a heron, but has a bigger belly, therefore called an alewife. And we think that he named them after the women who served beer in the alehouses in the colonies. So I thought that was a very curious name for a fish, but I think that's the one that has the most credence. These fish also have a number of other names, and these names tend to be very regional. So the two species that we have in our runs are the alewives, which are Alosa pseudoharengus. That term means false herring because they're not really the herring that I talked about before. These are different herring. And the bluebacks are called Alosa estivalis. Estivalis is from the Latin meaning spring, so they're spring herring. So those are their technical scientific names. But depending on where you are, you might also hear the terms glut herring, summer herring, black belly, kayak, wall-eyed, etc. Sawbellies is a term that sometimes is used to describe these fish because if you run your hand under the bottom or the ventral surface, it's serrated like a saw. So they're called sawbellies. Cat thrashers. In Canada, they're sometimes referred to as Gaspereau. But mostly in New England, folks just call them heron, no matter whether they're bluebacks or alewives. Now, I want to introduce some terms which might seem a little bit intimidating, but these 5 terms actually describe the entire life history of the species. So let me go through them and explain them to you. And as I do so, you'll learn a little bit more about river herring. The first term I'd like to use is anadromous. River herring are anadromous, and what that essentially means is that they spend their lives in the open ocean, but they come into fresh water to spawn. And then they return to the ocean where they spend most of their lives. This is in contrast to other fish like American eels, which are catadromous. They do actually the opposite. They spend most of their lives in the ponds and freshwater, and then they go back to the ocean to spawn. And then the young come back into the ponds to grow up. Now I have a little parenthesis here, and I have, except for landlocked populations, there are some river herring, particularly alewives, who for some reasons, mostly because of impediments to getting back to the ocean, have adapted to living in ponds, and they're referred to as landlocked populations. And there are many of these in the Great Lakes, for example. But for the most part, the fish that we're talking about are anadromous. The next term is called iteroparous. Iteroparous is iteration of spawning. These fish come back every year to spawn. And this is in contrast to a fish like the Pacific salmon, which only spawn once and then they die. Luckily, our fish have a much longer trip to their spawning habitats, and they come back year after year. It's not a one-time trip, so they're repeat spawners. The next term is sympatric. This refers to the fact that both river herring species, alewives and bluebacks, are sharing the same habitat. They're sympatric. They're both coming up our rivers into our ponds and lakes to spawn and sharing the resources there. The next term, philopatry, refers to the fact that many of these fish come back to the same rivers and streams and lakes to spawn every year. They come back to the same place. And there is some genetic evidence to suggest that there are larger stocks. Not every single river herring goes back to the same exact place to spawn, but many of them do. And then the last term is osmoregulation. And this refers to a really very complicated biological process whereby these fish, which live in the open ocean, which has a salinity of 32 parts per thousand, make their way into estuaries where there's decreasing salt concentration, and then into fresh water where there's no salt at all. So they have to undergo a very rigorous physiological process to adjust from full strength seawater to fresh water. And then when they return, they have to do the opposite. They have to physiologically adjust, going from fresh water back into the open ocean. So this is a process called osmoregulation. It's a very complicated process and it's not completely understood, but it is one that these fish accomplish every year when they come into our rivers to spawn. Now, the ranges of these two species is a little different. So they tend to overlap for the most part, but alewives are found a little more north than the blueback herrings. So if you look at the yellow tacks on this map, the alewives range is from North Carolina up to Newfoundland, whereas the bluebacks range is a little more southerly. They're from northern Florida to Nova Scotia, but most of the coast is shared by both species. There's just a little bit of region where alewives tend to range a little farther north and bluebacks range a little further south. Now, the size of these fish were historically bigger than they are now. Alewives historically were 13 to 14 inches, and now the average size is about 10 inches. Bluebacks historically were 13 inches, and now they're about 11 inches. And there are a lot of questions about why the size of these fishes are smaller now, and it's probably because of the pressure on them to spawn at a smaller size, and there's been probably some selection for smaller fish spawning. But that's a whole other issue that people are studying. They generally mature at 3 to 4 years of age. So they'll spend their first 3 to 4 years in the open ocean before we first see them coming back to our rivers. The alewives are believed to live about 10 years and the bluebacks to live about 7 years. And the females are slightly larger than the males because they have to accommodate eggs, which are larger than sperm. The way that we can tell the age of the fish is by this curious bony structure called an otolith, or an ear bone for the fish. And they're very tiny. They're about the size of a sesame seed. But if you dissect them out and section them under a microscope, you can actually see rings that resemble tree rings. And that's how we tell the age of the fish. So this particular fish, this otolith came up from a fish that was in its 4th year. So if you follow my cursor, that's the year it was born. By the time it was 2 years old, 3 and 4, it's going into its 4th year of life. So that's how we age the fish, and we know about how long they live and when they reproduce. Another question that you might wonder about is, what do they eat? And they're really filter and particulate feeders. They don't really gulp food like other types of fish. They're filter feeders, and they're eating mostly zooplankton. And in the ocean, they are feeding on zooplankton. The young of the year, when they are in the ponds, are feeding on zooplankton. But the fish that we see in this sort of middle bullet here, who are coming into our runs for spawning migrations, probably aren't eating very much at all during their whole trip to our ponds and back. They're on a mission to spawn, and they're really not stopping to eat along the way. Scientists who've dissected the stomach contents of these fish are finding that they're pretty much empty. So they don't really eat very much during their spawning migrations. They get back to the ocean and then they can find zooplankton and start feeding again. When do they spawn? Well, in New England, a rule of thumb is that when you see forsythia in bloom, the alewives are going to run. When you see lilacs in bloom, then the bluebacks are going to run. So there's about a 3-week difference between the runs of these two species. In this particular plant is called a shadbush. And this plant, it's a small tree. It's actually blooms typically when the shad are running. So some rivers also have a nice run of shad, and that's another cue in New England to anticipate when the shad might be running. The young of the year emigrate anytime from summer all the way through December. We sometimes see them leaving, and it really depends. The cues for the young of the year to leave tend to be the cooling of the water, the lack of food, and a good rainfall, which will stimulate a current, which will give them also a cue to go back to the ocean. So the young of the year tend to stay around in the ponds and where they've developed, and then go back even into the fall. And they look exactly like the adults when they emigrate back to the ocean. So this is a bag full of herring that were collected for a research project, river herring, and they are miniatures of the adults. They're about 2 inches long at this stage. And when they head out to sea, it's important to know that when we're talking about safe passage for river herring, we also need to realize that the young of the year also need safe passage. So it's not just the ones that are coming upstream, but the ones that go back downstream and the young of the year that we have to consider when we think about safe passage for fish. These fish are very commercially important, even from colonial times and even probably from native times. They were used for food, bait, fertilizer. One of the Native Americans, Squanto, taught the Pilgrims how to plant 3 alewives for every 5 kernels of corn because the alewives were good fertilizer in poor New England soil. They're also very important forage for ground fish, such as cod and haddock. Basically, everything eats them. They're prey for birds like ospreys and eagles. They're prey for marine mammals, such as whales and seals. And they're also prey for freshwater fishes, such as smallmouth and largemouth bass. They even prey for humans because before the days of refrigeration, they were a very important food source because they could be salted and preserved and were a good source of protein that kept people fed through the winter time when it was difficult to fish and farm. They're still very important as lobster bait. And another aspect of their commercial importance is that you don't need to exert a lot of effort to catch these fish. You don't need a pole, you don't need a boat, you don't need a hook, you don't need bait. The fish come to you each spring, and all you need is a way to collect them, a net or a chute or something like that. So that made them very important historically as well. This is an example of fish, river herring, being prepared for human consumption. These herring were salted and put on racks. So these 2 gentlemen are bringing the rack into a smokehouse. And after the fish are smoked, they're going to be packaged into these wooden boxes and sold. And they could keep like that for a very long time. So that was one of the ways that they were prepared for human consumption. Now, this is a photo of folks in Taunton, Massachusetts, looking into the Taunton River. And this was something that people would pay to do every spring. They'd pay a small fee to line up here and look at something. And what they were looking at was a herring run. So folks would take their children here every spring. You didn't go to Disneyland back in the day. You took your kids to the local herring run. And this particular herring run was mobbed every spring. And why people were congregated at this site was because the Taunton River, just like many, many other rivers in the Northeast, were dammed in many places for power mills to power things such as textile mills or to mill grain or for other industries. And these dams would impede the passage of river herring. But in Taunton, this is a ladder that was built to allow the fish to move upstream, because the herring fishery was also an important commercial venture in Taunton, as well as other areas as well. So all these folks would line up every spring to see the herring run. It was really quite a sight and quite an exciting thing, and was a sign of spring for many communities in the Northeast. The commercial harvest of river herring was very important, even though dams were built to impede the passage of these fish. So in the same river where we had the dams, we also had an important herring river fishery on the Taunton River. And you can see that a net was being used here, and the fish would be used and sold basically as bait. River herring was so important to some communities in the Northeast that they were featured on the town or historical commission seals. This is a seal from the town of Middleborough, Massachusetts, which features the two most commercially important things for the town. And one was the cranberry and the other was the herring, river herring. So commercially very, very important. Many towns leased the rights to their herring runs, and these revenues were important in running the municipalities. Paid for the schools, paid for the town workings of the town. So river herring were very commercially important. Here's a sample of the harvest on the Nemasket River. This is also in Massachusetts, where the herring were being put in these crates and sold for bait. Now, what happened eventually is that river herring harvest began to decline. This is a graph of what happened in Massachusetts. And on one axis, you see the pounds landed. And then across the horizontal axis is the year. So you can see that many, many river herring were harvested until about the mid-1970s. And then there was a severe drop in the number of river herring, and it really never rebounded, still very low at these levels. So in Massachusetts, a moratorium was passed in 2005, which closed the harvest of river herring. And the idea here was that since they take only 3 to 4 years to mature, that they'd close the harvest for 3 or 4 years, and then they'd see the numbers of fish start to rebound. Unfortunately, the numbers of fish have never started to rebound. So the harvest is still closed in Massachusetts because our herring runs are pretty much at very, very low levels. Here is a graph for the Maine fishery from the Maine Department of Natural Resources, which shows in millions of pounds on the y-axis and then years across on the x-axis that Maine also saw a decline that happened in around 1980. Maine has a much larger fishery than Massachusetts. You have many more rivers, bigger runs, but still there was a decline in the fishery. And at one point, a 2-day closure was imposed, and it looks like this is about the late 1980s. And then it was realized that that closure still didn't help the fish to rebound. So then a 3-day closure was imposed in 1995. and Maine still has a 3-day a week closure for the harvest of herring. But Maine still has a harvest allowed because every run has to show that their run is sustainable. And Maine has been able to do so, but it's not been the case in Massachusetts. Massachusetts has not shown long-term data which indicate that the runs are rebounding in any way. So harvest is still closed in Massachusetts. Now, the reasons for these declines throughout the Northeast, not just in Massachusetts and Maine, but also in Rhode Island and Connecticut, are overharvest, impediments to passage, degradation of habitat. In Massachusetts, cranberry farming practices put a dent in river herring populations. And I'm not going to talk about that very much today because that's just unique to Massachusetts. And then the other reason is bycatch in the Atlantic herring fleet. So what I want to do now is to address some of the ways that these particular reasons for decline are being addressed, and what's being done to address overharvest, what's being done to address impediments to passage, degradation of habitats, and bycatch. As I said, I won't be talking very much about cranberry farming because that's pretty much unique to Massachusetts. So in terms of restoring our runs, some of the things that are being attempted are trapping herring and trucking them and using this to restock also from other rivers. So stocking runs that are in decline. A number of projects involve the construction of fishways, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Mitigation of bycatch is very important and is being approached by a number of different agencies in a number of different ways. Dam and impediment removal is a very important strategy, which I'll talk about and which you folks are going to become familiar with this month as you go through your herring run projects, and then various other types of restoration projects. This is a picture of a bucket brigade, which was typical on the Mystic River near Boston before the fish ladder was installed. So you can see the dam behind these people here, right under the bridge structure, and there was no way that river herring could make it up that current of water. So what folks would do every spring was to gather the troops, bunch of volunteers, give them nets and buckets, and they would scoop up the fish, put them in the buckets, and then drive them upriver. Now, luckily, this Massachusetts had a major restoration project here and put in a fish ladder, an eel ladder, and now the fish can go up freely and we don't need the bucket brigade. But that was fairly common and is still common in some places. And restocking efforts, similarly, taking fish from some runs and bringing them to other runs is important where there have been no other ways to get the fish back upstream. Another way to restore fish passage is to build fishways. And there are many designs possible for these structures. I want to point out that one size does not fit all because you don't want to just design a structure for, say, for example, for just river herring, because shad also have to go upstream. Eels also have to transit. So you want to have structures that accommodate different species. A couple of different types of fishways are available. Weir and pool fishways are very common, including nature-like fishways, and they're also more industrial-looking baffle or denial type fishways. And I'll give you examples of these in a minute. And what has to be recognized when fishways are designed is what goes up must also come down. So you also need to design these so that there's safe transit for the fish going back out to the ocean. Now, in Middleborough, Massachusetts, which has one of the largest runs in our state, the Middleborough Lakeville community has built a major fishway to allow herring to go upstream. And it's made of concrete. And this is a weir and pool design. So there are these resting pools and these ladder-like or steps to allow fish to swim upstream and get to their spawning grounds. So this is called a weir and pool design fishway. Here's another one in Marstons Mills, which is also on Cape Cod, but it's a much smaller one, but it's the same design, resting pools and small step-like structures to allow the fish to go upstream. This is a weir and pool fishway in Damariscotta, Maine, and this is called a nature-like fishway because it's less industrial looking, it's more natural looking, but the design is basically the same. There are little pools, resting pools, and then weirs where the fish can transit and get upstream. This is also in the same run in Damariscotta, so several days a week, fishermen can employ this chute, which will bypass the run and collect the fish. They'll be collected in the chute and they'll be put into crates and used for lobster bait. So in Maine, we have various ways for these fish to be harvested under supervision by the local herring warden or someone else from the town. So this is the structure in Damariscotta that connects to the fishway and allows some of the fish to be harvested for lobster bait. This structure is called an Alaskan steep pass, and I think this one was on the Parker River, which is in northern Massachusetts, and it's a steel fishway. It's very industrial, and it's called an Alaskan steep pass because it was initially designed for salmon, but they are modified now to accommodate river herring as well. And you can see that river herring would never be able to ascend this particular impediment, but they can get up this fishway. Inside the fishway, there are these baffle structures which adjust the rate of flow to make it easier for the fish to get through this, this particular type of fishway. Dams are a very significant impediment to the passage of river herring throughout New England. And this little slide shows a summary from the American Society of Civil Engineers of the number of dams in New England and also in New York. So thousands, you know, in every state. Even little Rhode Island has 643 dams across the rivers. And these are significant impediments to fish passage. But luckily, many of these dams are being removed when they're not needed. When they are needed, then fishways can be installed instead. But when the dams outlive their function, the best thing to do in terms of fish passage is just to remove them. So many of these projects are underway or have been completed in the Northeast, and these projects have restored herring runs and have many other ecological benefits. The state of Maine has been a pioneer in dam removal. Some of the largest river and largest herring runs in the Northeast occur in the state of Maine. And dam removal projects, for example, on the Penobscot and Kennebec are considered to be international models and restored immense spawning habitats for river herring. This Community Reads program, which I'm involved with today, will give you insights into your local projects as you take part in some of the activities. I want to talk a little bit about bycatch because bycatch is a significant issue in terms of the depletion of herring stocks. What you see in this slide are pair trawlers for the Atlantic herring fishery. Now remember, Atlantic herring are not river herring, they're related, but they're fish that remain in the ocean, and they are also excellent lobster bait. And there's a big fishery that is geared to harvesting Atlantic herring. These pair trawlers can be very problematic because when river herring are in the ocean, some of their schools commingle with Atlantic herring. As these pair trawlers drag a net about the size of a football field, the nets don't discriminate what is being caught. So yes, river herring might be in this net as well as the targeted species, which are Atlantic herring. So it has been said that one pass of a pair trawler can eliminate a small run's worth of river herring, because these pair trawlers vacuum up tons and tons of fish. So there have been a number of efforts to mitigate the bycatch of river herring in the Atlantic herring fleet. Going back to 2011, there was a lawsuit from Earth Justice, which basically stated that the commercial trawl fishery was decimating river herring and shad by not upholding the Magnuson-Stevens Act of 1976, which was an act designed to conserve and manage fishery resources and designed to prevent overfishing. That lawsuit was lost, so river herring did not benefit from that. Shortly after, there was a petition from the Natural Resource Defense Council to list river herring as federally endangered species, and so they would be protected. And that petition was denied. There were also amendments to the Atlantic herring management plan, and there has been, this is a good movement, and there has been some sign of progress here. So the New England Fisheries Management Council has a recent amendment to the Atlantic herring management plan. And this amendment has two important components which affect river herring. One is the ABC rule, which limits the amount of allowable bycatch. So if a pair trawlers catch more river herring than a certain amount, they have to stop fishing. They can't continue fishing and continue with more river herring bycatch. And then that particular amendment created a 12 nautical mile buffer zone along the northeast coast. So the dark green, extending from northern Maine all the way to the Rhode Island border, is a 12 nautical mile buffer zone where the Atlantic herring fleet cannot fish during certain times of the year when river herring are likely to be in that region. And there's a further extended region off Cape Cod where there has been a lot of bycatch. So Cape Cod, it goes more than 12 miles to protect river herring stocks that go into our smaller rivers along southeast Massachusetts. I want to also talk about restoration projects and highlight my local project, one that I'm involved with now. It's not only important to remove impediments, but it's also important to restore habitat for river herring. And the local project that I'm involved with in Wellfleet is the restoration of our Herring River, which is the largest salt marsh restoration project in the Northeast. Compared to other restoration projects in Massachusetts, our Herring River project, seen here in blue, represents the largest project in Massachusetts and also the largest salt marsh restoration in the Northeast. Let me tell you about why this is being restored and how this came about. Our Herring River flows into Cape Cod Bay through Wellfleet Harbor. And this river was diked in 1909 with the intention of controlling mosquitoes and creating a destination for tourism. So the 200-foot mouth of the river became an 18-foot, if you can see the white line, the white arrows here, an 18-foot sluice gate. And this 18-foot sluice gate allows fresh water from the river to flow out into the bay, but it doesn't allow salt water into the estuary. So what has happened as a result of this is that we have salt water below the dike, but above the dike, it's mostly fresh. And we don't have any area of brackish water in between. So we've lost a lot of salt marsh, which I'll show you in a minute. But this is basically, if you enlarge this to see what the sluice gates look like, fresh water is allowed out, but salt water is not allowed in through these sluice gate structures. So this is all fresh now above the dike, and this is salt water below the dike. And as a result of this, I want to focus on this light green outlined area, which was salt marsh in 1908. So all of this region in Wellfleet and Truro, 2 towns, sorry, let me go back, was salt marsh. And now all that's left is from over 1,000 acres is a 10-acre swath of salt marsh here above the dike. So what happened was that we reduced the amount of salt marsh. It did nothing to help with the mosquitoes because it also blocked fish access to the estuary, and without significant fish to eat the mosquito larvae, the mosquito situation actually became worse. So that idea completely backfired. So the idea now is to replace this dike structure. Eventually, this will be a bridge and the river will be free flowing again. Salt water will be able to move in and clean up the river. The water quality is very poor. We have a lot of issues with coliform bacteria, with dissolved oxygen, with acidity. And so this restoration will improve habitat for river herring as well. Now, our river also has other structures which need attention, and other sites do as well. And those sites are culverts, and culverts are structures which are built under roadways. So this is a structure on our river. This is actually a culvert. And above here, if you can see my cursor, is a road called Old Kings Highway. And the culvert is basically a tunnel going under the culvert, which is collapsing. Culverts cause problems for fish passage in many ways. And I just want to show you a little video of what happens to our fish when they get to that culvert. They're swimming along just fine. They're going upstream. They're pretty close to the pond where they're going to spawn. But then they hit the culvert, and right in front of the culvert, they just stop. They seem to be very tentative about going through this dark passageway. And the fish sometimes stay here for hours. Sometimes they go back downstream and try to come back again. So we have a lot of issues with fish passage at this culvert. We had a student from UMass make this little infographic to try to explain what's happening at culverts, especially our culverts, but I'm sure this is can be universally applied. When fish reach the culverts, the river narrows to accommodate the pipes that go under the roads, and this changes the flow of the water. But we also found out, as a result from a graduate student study, that snapping turtles are hanging out in these culverts as well. And they're actually eating fish as they're coming through. So fish are just delaying in front of these culverts because they're long, dark tunnels and they're filled with predators. So what this produces is a delay in migration. The study found, in our case, that swimming upstream through the culverts takes more than twice as long as in the open river, and that the longer migration reduced the reproductive success of the fish. So in our case, there are many culverts that these fish have to pass, and many times there are delays in transit through these culverts. So not only do dams have to be addressed, but also culverts, which can be replaced with more fish-friendly types of culverts. Now, our project is similar to Maine's dam removal projects in its complexity. These projects are very, very complex. Ours required dozens of scientists over a decade of monitoring and environmental studies, engineering and design projects, abandoning or raising roads. Permitting is taking years. Has to be cooperation between local, state, and federal entities. In our case, we needed a formal memorandum of understanding between two towns, Wellfleet and Truro, and also the Cape Cod National Seashore, where much of this river is located. We also had a dedicated nonprofit leading the way. In our case, it was Friends of Herring River. In other river systems, there's always a nonprofit who has to take the lead. Otherwise, these projects don't seem to get done very efficiently. Dozens of supporting organizations. And there is settlement of potential conflicts with property owners, shellfishers, wildlife enthusiasts, recreational users, hunters, and on and on. And not to mention the price tag for these projects. The main dam removal projects were many millions of dollars, and ours will be as well. So finding the money, raising the money can be daunting at times. But when these projects are done, such as our river restoration, river herring will benefit from ours and other restoration projects. When you remove dikes and dams, you're removing impediments to passage. When you redesign culverts to be more fish friendly, you're not causing delays in migration and impacting the reproductive potential of the fish. When you restore estuaries and salt marshes, you're restoring habitat, cleaning the water. You have better water quality, better dissolved oxygen, cleaner water, and that benefits fish as well as humans. So with this in mind, when we have restoration underway, when we are able to do this, we can count our herring without having any issues. And hopefully, as these projects get underway, we'll be counting more and more fish coming up our rivers and restoring habitat and restoring these runs, which historically were so important to many of our towns. So with that, I want to thank everyone, and I'll be happy to entertain any questions.
Does anybody want to start with questions? If not, I have a few. Okay. So is there any evidence that any of these habitats are functioning sustainably, sustainable ecosystems after fish ladders have been replaced? You mentioned Maine. We don't have a moratorium up here, so it seems like we have sustainable habitats and ecosystems. Would you say that's true? And that they are rebounding?
Well, I would say that in Maine, every town or entity that has a permit to harvest fish has to show that what they're doing is sustainable. So they have to submit plans to show that they're sustainable, if not rebounding, at least sustainable harvest. In Massachusetts, we're not able to show any place that has the potential for a sustainable harvest because we haven't, our numbers are fluctuating so much. Just as an example, our small run in Wellfleet, the biggest year was about 60,000. Last year it was 13. Historically, it was hundreds of thousands. So we're not even close to the point where we could start to allow harvest. But in Maine, you have a different set of guidelines, and it's at least sustainable, if not rebounding.
Okay, but we're not at historical numbers, probably not even close.
No, I would say that's not the case, right?
Okay. Okay, but are there any other states where they're rebounding, or is it just Maine? Because you did mention at the end of the book, like North Carolina doesn't see river herring at all anymore. I was just wondering if any other states are doing as well as Maine.
No, as a matter of fact, as far as I know, the fishery is still closed in Rhode Island and Connecticut and New York. So Maine is the only Northeast state that still has an active fishery.
Okay. Okay. And I was going to ask you about bycatch, because when you wrote your book, it was back in 2014. But you kind of answered that question, because there's been no movement as far as more regulations on the Atlantic fishing.
Well, since I wrote my book, there has been an amendment to the Atlantic Herring Management Plan. And I mentioned that in this
Right.
presentation. We now have the ABC rule, which limits bycatch.
Right.
And we do have that buffer zone, 12 nautical miles from the shore. So that has happened since I wrote my book. The only problem with the ABC rule is that in order to determine that you have a certain amount of bycatch, you need a fishery observer on board to subsample the fish as they're being vacuumed in from these big nets that the trawlers drag. And a lot of the fleet is not paying for these observers, or the observers aren't on every time the fleet goes out, the observers aren't always there. So that is something that they need to work on. They need 100% observer coverage, which I don't think they're at yet. But how can you tell if you have, you're catching a certain amount of bycatch unless you have someone sampling what you're taking in?
Right.
But at least the ABC rule has been enacted, and the 12 nautical mile buffer zone up the coast is now in effect this year. So hopefully in the coming years, if these two measures are working, we might see some of our runs rebounding. We haven't seen it in Massachusetts at all.
I guess you kind of answered the question too, but I'm just interested to ask. You said that the natal homing, is kind of, did you say the natal homing has been kind of disproven as far as?
Well, genetically, what has been shown is that there are certain stocks that come to certain areas, but it hasn't been shown definitively that the same exact fish go into the same exact run every year.
And the otolith doesn't have anything to do with that?
No, that has to do with the age of the fish. What they're doing is genetics on the fish tissues to showing that there's certain stocks. So we had a study done on our river, which showed that there was something like a 20 to 40%. I don't want to quote the numbers exactly because I don't have the study in front of me, but a lot of the fish did return, but not all of them. So whether that means that they were eaten at sea or whether they went to another run, there has been some straying, they call it straying shown, whereas if you have two rivers very close to one another, some of the fish may go to the one further north or further south. So they don't have absolute site fidelity as far as spawning, but they come close to the area where they were before. So Philopatry is not 100%, but a lot of fish do go back to their natal runs, but not all of them.
Okay. Yeah. Could that be like a survival?
Well, it's actually good for the species if they don't all go back to the same exact place, because then you'd have genetic inbreeding. So it's actually good for some of them to stray a little bit to sort of mix up the genetic components of the population.
That makes sense. I was just thinking if they found an impediment in one stream, then they could try and adjust, but
yes, that's true. If there is an impediment in one stream, they may adjust and go to another stream. And also, we know that, for example, in rivers where river herring were not able to immigrate where they weren't able to migrate upstream because of some impediment. When the impediment is removed, all of a sudden you get fish there that weren't there before.
Oh.
So where are they coming from?
Yep.
They may have come from a nearby run.
Okay. And we could be seeing that here in Vassalboro where there's new access for them now. So,
Right, yeah, and you may get fish that were from another run.
okay. All right. Well, that's all my questions. So does anybody else have any?
Yeah, I was curious about when you're talking about the geography of New England and the fact that Maine's really the only place where there's a significant alewife run anymore. Wondering if there are any in Canada or any other parts of the world, or
Yes, there are some, well, the St. Croix River is between Maine and Canada, right? So there are some in Canada around Nova Scotia, but that's it. That's the range of the species from, northern Florida to Newfoundland. So those are the only places you would find herring runs.
it's interesting. It was interesting to see your graph where it was the 70s where Massachusetts kind of fell off, fell off the brink. And then around 1980, when Maine crashed. So I'm just wondering, can you pinpoint any specific thing that made those things happen at those times?
No, I can't, but Maine always had bigger runs and more fish. And I think the Massachusetts runs were probably a little more sensitive to overfishing.
Mm.
So they felt it first, I think.
Okay, thank you. It's very powerful, I feel. It's so important to our state, and it's really interesting.
And the economy, now that a lot of fishing has switched to lobstering, this is an important bait for them. And to have a sustainable fishery will not only maintain the lobster industry, as long as climate change, allows that, but it's also an important forage fish for cod, stocks, haddock, and other fish that are commercially important as well.
I'm just wondering, did they study, especially in Massachusetts, how housing developments would create impediments that would completely change the paths of the fisheries? Because the 70s saw a huge development, especially on Cape Cod. My father-in-law was an engineer there.
Mm-hmm.
So is there anything that indicates a direct correlation between the development of homes and communities with the flow of the rivers and streams for these fish?
Not a direct link, but I would say the construction of culverts so that roads can bypass rivers and streams, that certainly happened. Massachusetts had and still has a cranberry growing economy. And the way that cranberries are grown was very problematic to river herring because rivers were diverted, streams were blocked, then flooded in the spring to float the cranberries, and that had all sorts of repercussions on fish passage. I think the major development issues happen probably with industry, with the building of dams in the first place, rather than just with development of housing stock. So with the industrialization and the damming of a lot of rivers and streams for power and flood control, I think that had a very big impact.
I think it was wonderfully thorough, everything that you went through. So I don't have other questions.
All right. Well, if you think of any, you could always email me. I'd be glad to answer.
Well, thank you, Barbara.
You're very welcome.
All right. Well, I think with that, we can wrap up for the night. And,
okay, I can stop screen sharing. There we go.
All right. Thank you very much, Barbara. And
thanks so much, all of you.
All right. You're very welcome.
Thank you.
All right. Good evening.
I'll keep in touch.
All right.
Okay?
Very good. All right.
Take care.
Bye. All right.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Good night.